Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Harry Truman, and the focus is Iron Curtain and Truman's Resolve. The year is 1946, and that resolve initially will focus on domestic issues because Truman is worried about the post-war economy. Demobilization always difficult after a war. Millions of men are coming back from Europe ready to find their jobs once again. The economy always a bit shaky. Truman is worried about unemployment. He's worried about inflation. He knew this all well personally after what happened in the recession after World War I, which took his own store, the haberdashery, out of business. And in particular, in January of 1946, he's worried about labor. 2 million American workers were already out on strike. The auto workers, steel workers, meat packers, and he's worried about the railroads. They're threatening to go out as well. If they do that, the economy is basically going to shut down. Well, Truman and the administration got personally involved in these negotiations, and they got some success. 18 out of the 20 union brotherhoods actually agreed to terms, but 2 did not. The trainmen, the engineers, they were holding out. Now, Truman was getting frustrated. He made the point, once there's an armistice, everybody gets selfish all of a sudden. He's trying to work with the leaders of those 2 brotherhoods, A.F. Whitney and Alvanley Johnson. He knew both of these men, but it's not working. He's not making any progress with them. And again, he's going from frustration to anger to resolve. Truman told them, look, if you think I'm going to sit here and let you tie up this whole country, you're crazy as hell. You've got just 48 hours until Thursday at this time to reach a settlement. If you don't, I'm going to take over the railroads in the name of the government. Now, could he do this? Kind of questionable from a constitutional standpoint. Truman wasn't worried about that. He was going to go forward. The railroad men set their strike date of May the 23rd. Congress was going to be in session the next day. Truman was going to see them to seek permission to actually go do this, to bring the railroad men in and take over that industry, to keep the economy running. Well, they're negotiating overnight. They're negotiating the next morning. Truman gets to Capitol Hill. Still no settlement has been reached. He gets on the dais. He begins his speech. About halfway through, he's handed a note. He reads it aloud. Word has just been received that the railroad strike has been settled on terms proposed by the president. Big applause. They had kind of dodged the bullet, but things were still pretty tense across the economy when it came to labor. Another key area, the coal miners under John Lewis. Now, Truman didn't care for Lewis very much. He thought Lewis did some underhanded things, actually maybe even unpatriotic things during the course of the war. He called Lewis, he is as bullies are, as yellow as a doghound pup. He's a damn traitor. And in this case, what did he do? He threatened to seize the coal mines if they were going to go out on strike. Well, pretty soon after that, the coal miners went back to work, still uneasy. There was still some unsettlement going on in the economy. Truman was resorting to rather unconventional means to try to keep things going. It was messy, but in large part was working. Now, in the international scene, very rough situation going on, things not going well. The Council of Foreign Ministers meeting over in Europe, this post-Potsdam community to try to implement some of the things that the big 3 had decided. It's not going well. Truman is not happy, and he's not happy with James Byrnes, his Secretary of State, who was making decisions sort of without consulting him. Byrnes is coming back to the United States in December of 1946 and was going to give a major radio address on what was going on, and Truman said, you know what? First come to see me. He told him that, look, I told him our policy was not appeasement and not a one-way street. And I told him I didn't like the way in which I was left in the dark about the Moscow conference. I said it was shocking that a communique should be issued in Washington announcing a foreign policy development of major importance that I had never heard of. I said I would not tolerate a repetition of such conduct. He was already thinking of making a change. Part of the problem was Byrnes thought he should have been president. He thought he should have been FDR's VP in the 1944 election. He was bitter over that, kind of acting like he was in charge on his own. This, again, an uneasy relationship. It wasn't going to last long, but Truman was not ready to pull the trigger just yet. He did do some of his own international relations when he reached out to Winston Churchill, the former British premier who had been part of that big 3, was in the United States on vacation. And Truman reached out and said, look, why don't you come and give a speech? We'll go to my home state of Missouri. Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri was the proposal, which was the alma mater of Harry Vaughn, Truman's military aide, and talk about this situation going on, this Cold War that we've got between East and West. They had a grand time. They got in the train together. They swapped stories. They played poker. The people in Fulton came out for a great small-town American welcome to Churchill, who then gave a very forceful address. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent, Churchill said. If the population of the English-speaking Commonwealth be added to that of the United States, with all that such cooperation implies in the air, on the sea, and in science and industry, there will be no quivering, precarious balance of power to offer its temptation to ambition or adventure. This was cheered in the West. It was derided in the East. Joseph Stalin, the other member of the Big Three, the premier in Russia, said the following: "In this respect, one is reminded remarkably of Hitler and his friends. Hitler began to set war loose by announcing his racial theory, declaring that only people speaking the German language represent a fully valuable nation. Well, Mr. Churchill begins to set war loose also by a racial theory, maintaining that only nations speaking the English language are fully valuable nations, called upon to decide the destinies of the entire world. This divide between East and West, this Cold War, not only underway, it's getting colder." Now, Harry Truman, enormously popular when he took over the presidency just about a year and a half before, approval rating in the 80% range. It had dropped about 50 points. People were disillusioned. The economy was, again, still shaky with the labor issues. This East-West divide had a lot of people nervous. Again, this is the nuclear era with the atomic bomb kind of hanging out there over people's heads. Some people thinking that maybe the job's simply too big for Truman, that country farmer from Missouri. So in the midterm elections, big pickups for the Republicans. They took over both the House and the Senate. It had already been difficult for Truman to get some of his legislative program through. It was now going to be even tougher. But Truman was actually energized, it seemed like, by this a little bit. He wrote a letter to his mother and his sister, and he said, "From now on, I'm going to do as I please and let them all go to hell." Sort of Harry Truman being Harry Truman. Also took a vacation. Went to Key West in Florida. The first of 10 such trips to Key West, because he had a great time. He went fishing, he relaxed among friends, played poker. This was a good time, and he came back energized, really ready to get to work. And one of the first things he did was he relieved Secretary of State James Byrnes. The man he really wanted, the man he had kind of had his eyes on, the man he respected and revered into this role as Secretary of State, former Army Chief of Staff George Marshall. Truman said, "The more I see and talk to him, the more certain I am he's the great one of the age." He took over for Byrnes January of 1947 as Secretary of State, which frankly was just in time because the world situation, again, very perilous. The British had started to withdraw from some of their own international commitments from the past. They had their own economic difficulties, and they announced that they would be leaving Greece and Turkey. Now, this created a void, and the Americans were very concerned that the communists were kind of lying in wait. This not only had access to 2 more countries, potentially under communist control, but this was sort of a pathway to the Middle East, a pathway to Middle East oil. What were the Americans going to do about this potential Soviet imperialism? Well, Harry Truman was determined to prevent any domino effect of one state then another falling under the control of the communists. And so he decided that part of the problem was he simply had no faith left in the Russians and Joseph Stalin. Truman said, "The present dictatorship in Russia is as terrible as the Tsar's ever was. Unless Russia is faced with an iron fist and strong language, another war is in the making. Only one language do they understand. How many divisions do you have?" Divisions of military units, obviously, is his reference. Well, Truman decided to say the United States should step in and help Greece and Turkey, provide them financial assistance. Now, for this, he needed congressional support. Again, now in the hands of the Republicans, but he found an ally in Arthur Vandenberg, the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, very much of a statesman, and he agreed with Truman. We need to stop this movement, this imperialistic movement by the Russians. We need to block it if we can. I'll support your request for aid. So Congress approved a $250 million aid package for Greece, a $150 million aid package for Turkey. Truman also sent the aircraft carrier, the Franklin D. Roosevelt, into the area, just to maybe send a little bit of a message on what's going on here. And then Truman took his message a little further. This wasn't a one-off for Harry Truman. Truman said, "I believe it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. I believe we must assist free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way. I believe that our help should primarily be through economic and financial aid, which is essential to economic stability and orderly political political processes. It would become known as the Truman Doctrine, and it would be doctrine for the United States for decades to come. It was the most interventionist policy, foreign policy for the United States, perhaps in American history, and it was also putting that Cold War again on even colder sitting between Russia, the communists, the United States, and the West. In the meantime, Secretary of State George Marshall, he is off to Europe doing an introductory tour for his new role, and he came back and he's worried. The economies of Europe are crumbling. Again, why worry? In part because of opening the door to the communists to come in and perhaps sell the people on an alternative, some stability, and this was a concern, of course, for the United States and many of those Western democracies. So Marshall proposed a massive aid program for Europe, for the Western Europe and Eastern Europe. It was for all of Europe, and Harry Truman approved. Marshall was already scheduled to give the address at the Harvard commencement on June 5th of 1947 when he introduced his idea. Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Its purpose should be the revival of a working economy in the world so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist. They agreed to call it the Marshall Plan. First of all, Truman thought Marshall deserved it. Based on his entire career. He also thought politically, frankly, Marshall was more popular than he was. It was more likely to get through Congress if it was called the Marshall Plan than the Truman Plan, and so the Marshall Plan name stuck. Congress approved. The U.S. would give the aid, but the Europeans, under Marshall's idea, would actually plan how to use it and execute that plan. He met with representatives from 22 nations across Europe in Paris, and that was Western and Eastern. The Russians were there, several of the Soviet Eastern Bloc countries were there as well, but the latter stayed only about 5 days. They thought this was a threat to their national sovereignty. They walked out. For the rest, remarkable success. The Americans handed over in aid $17 billion over the course of the next 4 years. The execution of that had remarkable outcomes. In just 2.5 years, the industrial output in those countries was at 40% over pre-war levels. In the agricultural industry, output was over 20% more than pre-war levels. They didn't just save Western Europe from collapse, it was the foundation to prosper, and they kept the communists at bay. Remarkable success. Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, all at the same time. Now, in the meantime, Truman had some personal challenges. Mama Truman was ill. She's 94 years old. This is July of 1947. Truman had already made several visits back to Grandview, Missouri to see her. She eventually passed. Martha Truman had a strong influence on her son really throughout his entire life. Margaret Truman, Truman's daughter, put it this way about her grandmother. Her philosophy was simple. You knew right from wrong, and you did right, and you always did your best. That's all there was to it. Simple, not easy, but Harry Truman embraced that throughout his entire life. Now we're into February of 1948. The Soviets had a coup that they backed in Czechoslovakia, another southern nation falling under the Russian influence, and then they got even more provocative. March of 1948, they cut off West Berlin for all supplies. Now, in the agreements after World War I, or rather from World War II, the occupation zone that Berlin was in, the eastern part of Russia, was part of the Soviet zone, but the city of Berlin itself, the capital city, was also divided, and the West had sort of half that city with about 2.5 million citizens, and they had all been cut off now completely from any kind of supplies. And this obviously, again, a very provocative step. Big question was, well, what's the United States going to do about it? Now, the easiest thing to do would have been just leave. Harry Truman could have said, look, Berlin is just one city. Let's get out and live to fight another day. But he did not do that. He made the bold statement that we'll stay in Berlin come what may. That was part of his resolve. Well, what was he going to actually do? Well, Lucius Clay, the general, was in charge of the American contingent in Berlin at the time, and he had already started sort of a mini airlift to bring in supplies by air, figuring that even though the blockade on the ground was in place, the Russians were not going to start shooting American airplanes out of the air, and he was right about that. So they doubled down and tripled down on what became known as the Berlin airlift. Flights kept coming and coming round the clock, almost every minute. The locals actually helped build a new airfield to take all of the airplanes and all of the supplies. Over the next 2 years, the Americans brought in 277,000 flights, 2.3 million tons of food before the Soviets gave up. After a couple years, they realized this thing isn't working. Let's go put our attention in a different direction. Again, that Truman Resolve in this case, no shots were fired, and the crisis was averted. Now, Harry Truman made all these difficult decisions. It was a hallmark of his presidency, but he said that's what presidents were there for. Truman said that some men can make decisions and some cannot. Some men fret and delay under criticism. I used to have a saying that applies here, and I note that some people have picked it up. If you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. Well, Harry Truman was comfortable in a hot kitchen, and he had a lot more tough decisions ahead. It was going to remain hot, but those are stories for another day. That is Harry Truman, an Iron Curtain, Truman Resolve, from the life of Harry Truman. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.